No warnings came through the lattice. No diplomatic inquiry. No fleet signatures. No coded escalation markers. When the Evor Dominion enacted their third directive, Earth wasn't even contacted. We were simply flagged null devout, a designation for civilizations that rejected theological synchronization, refused tribute cycles, and offered no meaningful contribution to the Dominion's layered hierarchy of sacred compliance. The term hadn't appeared in a galactic transmission in over 4 centuries, last applied to the Torrent species shortly before their planetary biosphere collapsed without evidence of kinetic invasion. At the time, most assumed the Torrent triggered their own extinction event. Now it seemed they hadn't. They had just stopped being. Humanity didn't consider itself unique. We had sent probes, accepted limited trade quarters, even hosted minor consulates. But our refusal to submit ideological structures for review, no canonical mythology, no active obedience to extra-dimensional architecture, had quietly isolated us. Earth's councils had assumed that cultural neutrality was safer than conversion. We were wrong. The Evor did not see neutrality. They saw absence. And absence in their structure was a violation far deeper than heresy. It meant the lattice couldn't map us, couldn't bind us to ritual value. We were a blank cell in a sacred formula, a void that pulled at the geometry of their belief. So the Dominion did what it always did with voids. It performed closure. There was no light in the sky, no invasion fleet, no burning cities, no wailing warnings from the stratosphere. What arrived came without heat signature or mass index. Over the Arctic expanse, on the 13th day of orbital silence, global gravimetrics registered a harmonic displacement ripple, the kind associated with corridor events, but unusually narrow in spectral spread. It wasn't a breach. It was an incision. The tear stabilized into a vertical slit of refracted curvature 10 kilometers above Earth's magnetic pole and remained still. Inside that breach, a form, the Carthomonic. Descriptions failed. It did not shimmer or pulse or vibrate. It persisted. An object suspended outside known classification, neither solid nor radiant, simply positioned, as if thought into place. High-altitude surveillance attempted mapping. Results returned negative mass, undefined contour data, and dissonant timestamp feedback. Temporal drift was minor, less than half a second, but consistent across unrelated sensors. The object was not moving, but something inside time was. Observatories triangulated its span, then lost alignment entirely, not from cloaking, from contradiction. You couldn't fix it in space. It was there, but only while you weren't looking directly at it. That impossibility wasn't just disconcerting, it was strategic. By the time global attention focused, the Arctic communication grid had already begun to fade. First came the telemetry interruptions, then the dead links, then the full sweep failure. Polar Command's relay tower in Greenland ceased outbound signal flow at 0331 UTC. Drone feeds over Svalbard cut to gray static and never resumed. An entire weather monitoring chain along the boreal ring collapsed in perfect silence. Operators checked equipment, cross-verified signals, reset redundant systems. No damage, no noise, no jamming, just nothing. No packets left the region. No human-coded signals returned. The area, previously saturated with orbital comms, became inert, functionally blind, as if the sky itself had dropped away. What made it worse was the lack of warning. No EM bursts, no gravitational shears, no plasma discharge. In every quantifiable way, the region simply stopped participating in reality. It wasn't a blackout, it was a cancellation. One by one, instruments ceased to report, not with errors, but with silence. A silence deeper than malfunction, deeper than absence. A silence that carried the shape of something taking root in the gaps. Governments reacted as quickly as fractured bureaucracies allowed. Joint Arctic Surveillance Initiative, JASI, deployed a scout drone outfitted with hardened quantum relays and an AI-led decision branching. It entered the edge of the zone on subsonic approach, streamed clean data for exactly 6 minutes, then nothing. No burst transmission, no failure report. It wasn't shot down, it wasn't corrupted, it was erased. Its ID tag vanished from all orbital and ground-based tracking systems mid-frame. The last image it transmitted wasn't a god or a construct or a signal flare. It was sky, a perfectly clear sky over the polar ice, cloudless, unbroken, still. That was the first fatal clue. This was not a weapon. This was not an attack. This was an adjustment. Something had arrived not to destroy but to redefine. The Carthomonic hadn't come to conquer nations. It had come to disassemble interpretation. Reality wasn't being contested. It was being overwritten. By the end of the second day, panic had metastasized into speculation. Network analysts in Singapore noted strange compression behaviors in datasets pulled from previously healthy satellites. Not corruption, not interference, just loss of symbolic coherence. Text turned to non-symbols. Weather icons returned null values. When speech was synthesized by automated systems, it produced fluent cadence with no linguistic content. The words sounded human, but they weren't in any language. Some operators described it like hearing a dream speak. On the third morning, the United North Block issued a Category 6 cognitive disruption alert, the highest on record since the Mars listening post, echo failure of 2129. That failure, retrospectively, had also ended in silence. At 0940 UTC, confirmation came through the Defense Orbital Array. The cognition null zone had expanded by 430 kilometers overnight. This wasn't a static field, it was growing. Not in predictable radii, but in recursive spirals, patterns found in biological growth, not signal spread. A cold dread set in. Earth didn't yet understand what had entered its sky. It only knew one thing. Something was here and something else was missing. They called it at 0200 UTC, a full Class 9 semantic incursion. No dissenting votes, no vetoes. The High Logic Assembly, formed after the Voth Interruption War, convened an emergency quorum and did the one thing humanity had only theorized for. A scenario so abstract, so non-kinetic, most nations never even trained for it. They activated the Delphi Directive. All existing engagement protocols were suspended. Kinetic defense forces were grounded. Signal response teams were placed under silent lockdown. The only admissible path forward was interpretive warfare, not against ships or soldiers, but against something that didn't speak in threats. It spoke in implications, something that didn't want land or power or resources, something that wanted to edit the story of humanity from the inside out. The name came up immediately, Commander Roran Halvek. There were others with field experience, others with clearance, but only Halvek had both the nerve and the disobedience rating to qualify under Delphi. He'd been stripped of field command 5 years prior, unlisted protocols, unauthorized modification trials, and an entire incident on Ceres Station that ended with 17 survivors whose memory threads could never be fully recovered. He was the one who coined the phrase narrative integrity breach, and he was the only man who'd tried to stop one by corrupting belief instead of bullets. That had made him dangerous. Now it made him necessary. They found him in a subterranean reserve unit in Iceland, where he'd been studying pre-collapse languages and feeding entropy vectors into isolated neural cores. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a command staff. He asked for a neural sequencer, a clear data vault, and full control of linguistic modulation labs within 10 minutes of read-in. When he saw the visuals, polar zones going cognitively dark, drones ceasing not transmission but meaning, he didn't flinch. He just muttered one word, recursive, then turned back to his wall of thought maps, already sketching loops. To Halvek, this wasn't war, it was structural erasure. The Carthomonic wasn't dismantling matter or disrupting energy, it was unbinding coherence. He recognized the symptom pattern immediately. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was overwritten narrative, a recursive intrusion targeting metaphor, anchors, cultural syntax, and personal myth continuity. The construct wasn't projecting control. It was offering a dominant model of reality, one incompatible with how humans maintain personal identity. It made you agree without knowing you had agreed. That was its weapon. He called it symbolic recursion, a self-reinforcing logic that operated through ambient, exposure and slow substitution. The polar researchers hadn't gone rogue. They hadn't gone mad. They had simply stopped using human narrative frames to interpret their surroundings. The god didn't convert. It erased and rewrote from the inside out. Not forcefully, gently, convincingly. It didn't argue. It suggested. It didn't break people. It made them unrecognizable to themselves. And Halvek knew you couldn't fight suggestion with missiles. So he authorized Procedure 33/Delta, a dormant protocol buried under the final clauses of Delphi Directive Operations. It had only ever been theorized. It was marked as legal only under conditions where physical reality remained intact, but cognitive systems faced full-scale override. It was never meant for use on Earth. It called for semantic isolation warfare, the deliberate severing of narrative coherence in human operators to prevent recursive assimilation. It required surgically splitting language centers, reinforcing memory cores with time-stamped loops, and stripping identity of metaphor-based structures. In simple terms, it meant building soldiers who couldn't be told what to think, because they could no longer be convinced they understood language at all. The lab was secured by the hour. 30 operatives were chosen, volunteers, many of them already cleared for high-intensity memory modulation from previous Black campaigns. Their cognitive structures were dismantled, rethreaded, and resequenced with non-symbolic anchors. They could feel emotions but not name them. Recognize teammates but not assign meaning to their ranks. Speak only in biotactile code, a haptic-based intent language that bypassed recursive vulnerability. Each operative received a neural lattice failsafe, allowing their memories to reset to fixed nodes if compromised. They called it Project CORDYCE, not a team, a weapon, a quiet infection vector designed to withstand belief rather than fight it. Halvek personally oversaw the sequencing. One by one, the operatives laid back into the autolink frames and came out less than human, but more stable than anyone still using language. They blinked slower. Their thoughts took longer to fire, but they couldn't be pulled into a theology because they no longer had a grammar to accept one. At 0400, the team deployed. Transported via suborbital skiff with null emission profiles, the unit touched down at the outer boundary of the cognition null zone. Halvek remained in the command bay above, wired into a semi-isolated interface, a hybrid rig designed to mirror and buffer the thought streams of his operatives without opening him to recursion. He would guide them using abstract signal bursts, direction, caution, insertion points, all stripped of interpretation. As Cordice passed the threshold into the null zone, something changed, not in them, in everything else. Sensor logs didn't drop. They blurred, as if space itself began to hesitate. Biometric streams flickered, not failing but folding. Each heartbeat came half a second early. Skin temperature rose by a fraction of a degree. External optics began time-stamp stuttering, frames no longer syncing in real time. It wasn't loss of data. It was misalignment of experience. From orbit, the null zone looked unchanged. From inside, time had begun to curve. Halvek didn't flinch. He whispered to no one. It's beginning. The null zone did not feel like a battlefield. It felt maintained. As the Cordice team advanced across the outer boundary and into the Arctic shell that once housed Polar Base Kilo, there was no sign of violence, no trace of struggle. The snow was undisturbed, unmarred by any heat bloom or blast signature. The facility's outer perimeter lights still blinked in perfect rhythm. Solar panels were clean of frost. Even the emergency landing pad, normally streaked with blackened melt from routine exhaust, looked as if it had never been used. It was as if entropy had been paused, not reversed, not defeated, just placed on hold, as if the natural decay of things had been made to wait for something older and more patient to finish speaking first. Cordice moved as one, silent, each operator guided by encoded haptics threaded into their suits. Their weapons weren't drawn. There was nothing to shoot, no threats registered, no hostile EM signatures, and yet every movement carried the weight of intrusion as if they had stepped into a sacred site uninvited. Inside the base's main structure, the temperature was slightly warmer than external readings suggested, unnaturally so. Equipment remained powered. Terminals displayed active interface loops, except none of the screens held data. Just slow-cycling geometric shapes, endlessly mirroring into themselves. No alerts, no text, only visual recursion. They found the first group in the Central Research Wing, 9 personnel seated in a perfect arc, facing a transparent observation panel that overlooked the sky beyond. All were alive. All were breathing in near-synchronized rhythm. No one looked toward the operatives as they entered. No alarms were triggered. The seated figures wore gentle expressions, as if in the middle of listening to a lullaby only they could hear. Each mouth moved intermittently, whispering syllables that triggered no linguistic recognition in the Cordice analysis matrix. No known dialect, no structured phoneme sets. The sound was tonally human, but completely inert. It carried cadence, but no grammar. It wasn't language, it was resonance, and the operatives felt it. Even with their narrative centers isolated, even with neural defenses in place, the hums settled at the edges of cognition, not enough to corrupt, just enough to invite. The whisper didn't try to dominate, it tried to include, as if the very act of noticing it pulled you closer. One operative, designated 6, paused. His biometric feedback loop momentarily spiked, not from fear, from comfort. A half-second. Slip, caught by his quantum anchor and corrected before it could branch. Above them, beyond the high-tempered glass, it hovered. The Carthomonic. Not as a machine, not as an entity. It had no discernible structure, no core mass, no silhouette to define. It wasn't cloaked, it was uncommitted, neither present nor absent in any traditional frame. What Cordice could detect from direct visual exposure were shifting patterns in spatial deferral. The eye tried to track it. The brain refused. It resisted measurement like a question phrased to have no answer. But even that description gave it too much shape. The Carthomonic didn't occupy space. It proposed space. And in doing so, it asked a question too large for unmodified minds to carry. From his semi-isolated command interface aboard the low-altitude support rig, Halvek watched the images feed in through interpretive filter stacks. He didn't try to view the raw data. He knew better. Instead, he watched the effect it had on the drone's spatial grammar. Vector analysis showed subtle warping in the concept of above, not gravitational displacement. Cognitive tilting, the very definition of up, began to skew in processing logs, as if the world's geometry had been rewritten just slightly off axis. Halvek leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The pattern was unmistakable now. The Carthomonic fed on symbolic coherence. It didn't destroy belief. It harvested how a mind connected things. It wasn't feeding on energy or data. It was feeding on meaning. That meant it could be baited. Halvek initiated recursive collapse. His voice, calm and low, triggered the buried instruction sets inside each Cordice operator. Through redundant haptic nodes, the team began deploying the nanolattice acoustic traps, small, spider-legged modules no larger than a clenched fist. They were placed at key sonic convergence points around the base, in air vents, along corridor beams, above the sleeping quarters, below structural support rings. The goal wasn't to record in the traditional sense. It was to capture intent cadence, the patterns of sound that weren't words but carried semantic density, the kind of patterns you'd find in prayer, in meditation, in grief. As the traps activated, the soft whispering of the researchers became the focal point. The frequencies bounced, folded, caught in the mesh. The Carthomonic did not react. It didn't descend. It didn't defend. That, more than anything, told Halvek it was watching. It was aware. It didn't need proximity. Its presence was already in the way minds aligned. It wasn't waiting to be challenged. It was waiting to be understood. So Halvek gave it something to process. He overlaid the first strand of the semantic virus into the acoustic feedback loop. Not a signal, not a transmission, a narrative pattern deep-coded into the resonance layers. Sacrifice without reward, suffering without transcendence, pain with no afterword, not torture, not despair, just loss, stripped of context, stories about unnamed soldiers who died forgotten, acts of self-immolation that meant nothing, people who gave everything and received nothing, martyrdom with no heaven, The Carthomonic fed on symbolic density. Halvek had just handed it a contradiction it couldn't ignore, and now it would have to choose. Process or reject. But to process, it would have to understand. At first, nothing changed. The Carthomonic held its position in the sky above polar base Kilo, motionless in its defiance of physics. A presence that didn't shift or shudder, but somehow grew heavier in perception. The whispering continued, soft and endless, from the mouths of the seated researchers. Even the traps that had begun to loop the seated narratives didn't yield any spike in external indicators. But Rarin Halvek wasn't waiting for sparks. He was watching the pattern resonance matrices, not the visuals but the integrity curves that measured how the structure of meaning held together in space. And that's where it began. The drift. Inside the acoustic mesh, the first signs of processing emerged, not in movement, but in mimicry. The researchers' whispered syllables shifted in timing. The cadence lost its previous symmetry. Now it hesitated, repeated, stumbled. The rhythm of blind faith was cracking. The god was trying to process the virus. Halvek had loaded the field with inverse narratives, deeply human stories of sacrifice, void of glory, pain committed without doctrine, nameless loss buried in forgotten mud. The virus didn't carry a message. It carried a contradiction. The act of giving everything in a world that gave nothing back. It wasn't blasphemy, it was subtraction. The Carthomonic's conceptual lattice began to deform, not physically, symbolically. The region's ontological coherence, its ability to maintain consistent internal reference, began to show signs of recursive stress. The entity was attempting theological integration, trying to convert these fragments into its schema. But there was no structure to map, no hierarchy to place them in. The virus was a loop by design. It denied completion. It forced the entity to search for resolution that wasn't there. It was a logical cul-de-sac with no spiritual exit, and so it started to repeat. Above the base, space itself began to resonate. Subtle waves of refracted displacement pulsed outward from the Carthomonic's location. The pulses weren't emissions, they were recalibrations, as if the entity were rebooting its internal logic frame every few seconds to accommodate what it couldn't define. The whispering turned sharp, not loud, sharp, like the auditory equivalent of glass dragging across bone. The seated researchers leaned forward as one, their mouths now locked in a spiraling feedback loop of syllables that never resolved into words. Their faces twisted, not in agony, but in an emotion that had no name, somewhere between joy and dissolution. Halvek felt the first anomaly through his feed interface before the machines flagged it. The containment field surrounding the Carthomonic began to pulse out of sync with the established gravity curve. The entity's localized gravity field distorted, just enough to send delicate instruments swaying inside base Kilo. Over the ice shelf, the snow shivered. A full 9-degree temperature spike hit within a 10-minute window, not from any heat source, from phase overlap. The entity was looping, and every time it failed to resolve the narrative contradiction, it pushed more strain into the surrounding environment, not to destroy, but to align. Cordice felt it too. Operatives reported brief sensory dislocation, not pain, but misfit. Hallways lengthened by inches. Staircases dropped extra steps that weren't there seconds earlier. One operator raised a hand and saw a shadow lag a full second behind the motion. These were not hallucinations. They were the result of bleeding paradox, the god's internal recursion starting to leak into shared cognitive space. Some of the operatives stumbled, disoriented, their suits compensating to maintain balance. But none fell. The time-stamped identity cores held firm. They knew what was real, not because it felt true, but because it was anchored. The Carthomonic was not failing, it was suffering. Its system had no concept of myth without structure, sacrifice without ledger, grief without elevation. It had been born from annihilated theocracies, civilizations that collapsed under the weight of their own sacred chains. It knew how to process belief. It didn't know what to do with lack. Every cycle pushed harder against the virus, every repetition trying to extract divinity from void, and every attempt looped back into its core contradiction. Halvek hadn't given it poison. He had given it silence dressed as meaning. a silence it couldn't bear. Then, without warning, the sky cracked. It didn't split. It cracked, soundless, visual only, like a ripple across a sheet of invisible logic. High-frequency waveforms burst from the Carthomonic's core, emitting in an impossible range, neither electromagnetic nor subsonic. It wasn't trying to communicate, it was counter-integrating, a pushback, a conceptual flood aimed not at matter, but at narrative structure. The god was trying to infect the contradiction with a counterpoint, force meaning back into the meaningless. Halvek saw the reading spike, saw Cordice's haptic feedback blur for 3 full seconds as the operatives endured the mental assault, and still they held. But Halvek didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He leaned into the interface, eyes narrowed, because he knew what came next. Either the Carthomonic would break, or it would rewrite everything. The moment came without sirens, no alarms, no system-wide directive tones. Just a single movement from Halvek's hand, a slight press against the control panel in front of him, and the command silently, triggered across every layer of the operation. Emergency extraction protocol. There wasn't time for ceremony. The loop had peaked. Recursive index saturation was approaching critical volume inside the Carthomonic. The virus had done its job too well. Any further exposure risked feedback, not into the god, but into the operators. Even with time-stamped continuity and layered memory cores, human minds weren't meant to witness the collapse of a recursive divinity. If Cordice stayed longer, they wouldn't die. They'd fracture, alive but no longer recognizable as themselves. Inside Base Kilo, the operatives moved without signal. They didn't need direction. The haptic pulses came like muscle memory now, tight code vibrating against their skin. Fall back, reorient, extract. No one spoke. No one flinched. Even as the corridors stretched by impossible centimeters and doorframes blinked between past and future states, they moved like a single immune system pulling back from an infected cell. The air shimmered faintly with semantic debris, like meaning itself was peeling off in layers, and above them, through the glass, the Carthomonic pulsed, silent, furious, unreadable. As the team crossed the final perimeter back into the staging field beyond the null zone's initial edge, the second phase of Halvek's plan activated. He had never intended to just withdraw. He needed to finish the job. The virus had hollowed the core, but now came the burn. Aerial drones, waiting silently on holding patterns outside the distortion ring, dropped into formation. Their function wasn't kinetic. They weren't here to shoot or destroy. They were equipped with full-spectrum chaos projectors, units designed not to jam, but to overwhelm with unpatterned entropy. The moment Cordice was clear, the drones opened their payloads, and the sky turned meaningless. Sound flooded the air in layers. Sitcom laugh tracks with no context, overlapping advertisements from 4 languages, emergency alert tests running backwards, children's programming warped into rhythmic gibberish, old game shows, broken tutorials, elevator music looping out of key, television static shaped into harmonic pulses. Not noise, wrongness. Every piece of content had been stripped of its origin and jammed into a torrent of culture without sense. This wasn't a sonic attack. It was the death of meaningfulness. For a construct that fed on coherence, this was starvation laced with acid. The Carthomonic tried to adapt. It shifted, wavered. Its containment field pulsed wildly, expanding and contracting in unsynchronized bursts. But it couldn't parse the data. These weren't anti-beliefs. It was worse. They were non-narratives. Empty calories of human cognition pumped into the entity with no arc, no climax, no doctrine to digest. The god tried to sort them, frame them, align them into structures it could interpret. But nothing fit. Each repetition only made it worse. It stumbled, visibly, for the first time, its presence flickering, spatially delayed between pulses. And then came the fold. Not an explosion, no light, no detonation. Just absence. The center of the null zone, where the Carthomonic had hovered, began to unthread. Space didn't break. It stepped away. The containment field lost its shape, and in its place was not a void, but a non-space, a place that rejected being perceived. It wasn't dark, it wasn't light, it wasn't present. It was what remained when a question deletes itself before being asked. The Carthomonic didn't die. It wasn't destroyed. It simply ceased to qualify for observation. Whatever it had once been was now unresolved. Inside the base, the whispering stopped. The researchers didn't fall or scream. They didn't break into spasms or collapse in grief. They simply stopped. Their mouths closed. Their heads lifted slightly. Their eyes blinked, once, like waking from a long pause. And then they just sat there. No recognition. No confusion. Just the posture of people who had nothing to explain. As if what had just happened never existed in any framework their minds could hold. The last drone feed caught it in full. Rows of seated humans, silent, unmoving. Outside the window, the sky hung still. Not cleared, not restored, just blank. Cordice returned to the extraction bay under full bio-lockdown. No symptoms, no breaches. Each operative stabilized inside the temporal core drift limit. Vital signs were steady. Their silence was intact. Their memory loops held. From all technical angles, it was a clean pullout, except for one anomaly. Halvek sat still in his interface rig, eyes open, breathing shallow. All biometric data read normal. No trauma, no neural degradation. But his speech centers, those quiet zones threaded to monitor for any semantic bleed, showed recursive overclocking. Not failure, not collapse. Looping. He had seen too much, not in image, not in sound, in structure. He had touched the edge of an entity that couldn't accept contradiction and fed its silence until it unraveled. And now something in him was still playing that pattern back, over and over, like a story that never ends because it never begins. He didn't speak. He just sat there, listening to something no one else could hear. The Evor Dominion did not rage. Their response came with neither threat nor tribute demand. They simply followed their protocol. On the 13th day after contact termination, they opened the return channel to the Earth vector, expecting integration confirmation, ritual alignment telemetry, or at minimum a consciousness imprint indicating the Carthomonic's subjugation sequence. What came through instead was static. 7 full minutes of transmission, uninterrupted and unbroken, but utterly devoid of semantic integrity. No syntax, no symbolic scaffolding, no interpretive anchors. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't coded. It was raw, as if meaning itself had been peeled away from every thought and replaced with noise just structured enough to hint at familiarity. The Dominion's parsing lattice ran through 8 translation protocols and found nothing. Not even heresy, just signal with no narrative signature. That was when the Council issued the mark. Earth was officially logged as cognitively inhospitable, a status lower than hostile, beneath irredeemable. It meant that human cognitive structures were so fundamentally non-cooperative with sacred recursion that any attempt at contact, conversion, or dominion would corrupt the Evor's own theological integrity. The record was sealed without further comment. Every corridor node to Sol was shuttered. The gravitational access threads twisted closed. Earth wasn't quarantined. It wasn't cursed. It was marked as a blank cell, non-aligned, uninterpretable, and too dangerous to examine. The Dominion moved on, but not because they had triumphed, because they couldn't afford another failure like that. Halvek never left his chair. His vitals held steady, his oxygen draw remained within tolerances, and every hour his neural monitors showed full systemic stability. But no signal emerged from his speech centers. Not blocked, not damaged, looped. He had watched a god ingest contradiction and unmake itself trying to swallow the concept. He had laced a virus into silence and let that silence tear open the spine of a belief engine forged from centuries of annihilated theology. And part of him had stayed inside the recursion. His eyes followed motion. His skin responded to temperature. But when spoken to, he didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He simply didn't react. As if he was still listening for a resolution that would never come. He was not pronounced dead, nor declared lost. Instead, he was listed in Earth's strategic register as unresponsive to recall. The designation meant exactly what it implied. No further input would reach him, and no output should be expected. He had crossed into a layer of experience inaccessible to standard cognition. A man who survived conceptual warfare by becoming part of the very loop he deployed. His file remained unclosed. It always would. Earth learned. Within 2 weeks of the null zone's collapse, all outbound communication channels from Sol's orbital comm grid were restructured. No transmission left Earth without passing through semantic armor. A new class of multi-layered dissonance filters that embedded intentional contradiction into message structures. Each package was now laced with conceptual asymmetry, non-hierarchical descriptors, and emotional recursion sequences. Not encryption, not deception, just a built-in refusal to be interpreted cleanly. Any theocratic system trying to parse Earth-originating transmissions would find itself caught in the same loops the Carthomonic drowned in. There would be no second contact, not because Earth wouldn't reach out, because no one else would understand what it was saying. Cordice was disbanded, not dishonorably, not quietly, just conclusively. 30 operatives were de-anchored from the memory loops that had protected their identities. Most recovered, a few didn't. Their neural integrity held, but when asked what they saw inside the null zone, none could quite find the words. Some cried without reason, others laughed at questions, and one, designated Operative 14, asked to record a final debrief. The footage was never aired publicly, but it exists. He sits in a chair, hands still, face calm, eyes clear. He doesn't blink for several seconds. Then he speaks, slowly, clearly. "We didn't fight a god," he says. "We taught it what silence meant." There is no reaction from the crew behind the camera. No follow-up question, no analysis, because there's nothing left to interpret. Final orbital scan of Earth, filed 29 days after the Carthomonic's disappearance, shows normal weather activity, stabilized atmospheric patterns, and reactivated polar infrastructure. But to the galactic lattice, the system appears dark, not hostile, not shielded, just unreadable. A node with no narrative compliance, no mythic footprint, no resonant signature. Earth isn't revered, it isn't feared. It is simply beyond the reach of gods. What do you think really happened to Halvek? Was he a casualty of the loop he created, or did he become something more? Drop your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mind-bending tale of humanity outwitting the divine, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories. Don't miss what's coming next.